This is Glass City Humanist, a show about humanism, humanist values, by a humanist. Here is your host, Douglas Berger.
In this episode, we talk to John Lombard, a former evangelical missionary and church planner who spent over 25 years in China. We talk about his journey to humanism, his important work as a cultural diversity consultant for businesses, and his longtime efforts to educate the West about the Mosuo, an ethnic minority in China.
Glass City Humanist is an outreach project of the secular humanists of Western Lake Erie, building community through compassion and reason for a better tomorrow. If you live in the greater Toledo, Ohio area and are looking for a humanist community, then please check us out. You can reach our group at humanists.wle.org or from a link on our website, glasscityhumanist.show.
With us today is John Lombard. He is the founder and president of the Language of Culture, and he does consulting for corporations and other groups on cultural diversity. And he was born and raised into a fundamentalist evangelical Christian home, even became a preacher and a church planter. And he went to China as a missionary. And after a few years in China, he became an atheist and is now a secular humanist. Thank you for being with us today, John.
Yep, my pleasure.
All right. From an evangelical missionary to atheism is a really big step. Was it a gradual process for you, or was there just one particular incident that helped move you over?
No, it was very gradual. You know, a lot of atheists who are ex-Christian, particularly ex-evangelical or ex-fundamentalist, they tend to have gone through a process of a feeling of anger, betrayal, harm, something like they got out because of negative feelings. I was the opposite. I absolutely did not want to leave. I wanted to keep my faith. Like everything in my life was built, my family, my friends, I was a Christian missionary. Everything was built around that. So it was a very gradual process. Started in Bible college, where as I was studying theology, reading the Bible, looking at church history, all these things, I started recognizing a lot of problems, contradictions, everything like that. But rather than seeing these as reasons to question my faith, I simply concluded it was because I didn't have enough faith or I didn't have enough understanding. And by studying it, there were lots of people much more knowledgeable than me who didn't think these things were problems at all, right? So all I needed was to study more, learn more, pray more, get guidance from the Holy Spirit, and I would come to be able to reconcile and understand these apparent problems. But as time went on, and it took over a decade, all that study, research, prayer, everything just led to finding more and more questions, more and more problems. And I kind of, like I said, I fought against it for quite a while. And then literally, no exaggeration, it was literally like a one-day deconversion, let's say. One day I just suddenly realized I can't claim to believe this stuff anymore. It just does not make sense. There's no way to reconcile it. And within a space of 24 hours, I went from, Bible-believing evangelical fundamentalist Christian to atheist, and within a few days I was a secular humanist, and I've been a passionate secular humanist ever since.
And did that kind of also lead you to, in the process, once you had deconverted, led you to working with the Clergy Project? The Clergy Project came many years later. It didn't exist. I wish something like that had existed. When this happened to me, I thought I was alone. I had never heard, you almost never heard of missionaries, devout Christian people taking positions of Christian leadership, things like this, rejecting it all, becoming atheists. People had doubts, but I consider myself very much an aberration.
And it wasn't until many years later, I think it was about 2014, it would have been around 2000 that I became an atheist. 2014 that I discovered the Clergy Project. They started in 2011. And it was an incredible revelation to me to discover just how many other people there were like me. TCP, we now have over 1,000 members. These are all people who were in positions of religious leadership, some of them very well-known, popular Christian leaders, and we not just Christians. We have people from Muslim backgrounds, from all sorts of different religious backgrounds. So it's a real revelation to me to discover that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't a weirdo, that there were actually tons of other people like me. So when I came in, it wasn't so much for support that I needed. I was well past that stage. But to be able to come in and provide that support to other people going through that transition right now.
Yeah, your journey is pretty much similar to mine. I wasn't, although I wasn't a preacher or anything like that, I was just a common everyday Christian, was that, it didn't make sense to me. A lot of the teachings didn't speak to me, didn't make sense. And like you, I tried to fit my feelings into my beliefs. And then it got to the point where it's like, well, why am I doing it? Why don't we just go completely to the atheist side? And then eventually I found humanism, but it was the same thing. It was like, I thought I was the only person that thought these things, that I was totally alone. And it was great when I was able to meet up with some humanists and follow that path. So that was very good for me.
For more information about the topics in this episode, including links used, please visit the episode page at glasscityhumanist.show.
Your main job, what pays the bills, is you're a consultant, and you talk to companies and other groups about cultural diversity and inclusion. What does that consist of?
Yeah, well, I think because people listening to this are probably going to come from a wide variety of different backgrounds, I think I should explain a little first about diversity, inclusion, and equity. So diversity, very simple, just trying to draw people in from many different backgrounds, whether that be focusing on gender diversity, getting a more equal balance between males and females in the workplace, racial diversity, again, having more balance in the different races in the workplace, LGBTQ diversity, all these different areas. Diversity is just about creating more balance and representation of those different groups. However, diversity by itself is not necessarily useful. If you get a company that has an equal balance of males and females, for example, but the men still have all the positions of leadership, still have patriarchal attitudes, women are kept in lower positions, stuff like that, you have technically gender diversity, but you don't have equity. So equity is the next step, create, not just having diversity, but providing equal opportunity, equal treatment for everybody in the company. But again, that's not necessarily enough. I know a lot of organizations, like I've gone to a number of atheist conferences, humanist conferences, things like this. When you look at them, they're still very, very predominantly white and male, so. And when you talk to them, say, oh, well, we welcome everybody. We welcome everybody. We welcome all genders. We welcome all races. We welcome all sexual orientations, everything like this. But being welcoming isn't enough. It's about inclusion is more about actively reaching out to people from those different groups, intentionally creating a space for those groups, everything like this. If, for example, let's say we have a Chinese person from mainland China has immigrated to North America, been here 1 or 2 years. They go to a secular humanist conference. Majority of the people there are white. Among the Asians, fewer Chinese, fewer are immigrant Chinese who actually speak his language. Everything is done in English, which he's not that familiar with. even if people are nice to him, welcoming, all those types of things, he's still going to feel like an outsider. He's not really going to feel included in everything that's happening. So when we talk about, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's about really taking those three things and putting them together. So I do cultural diversity. And so that's specifically looking at cultural issues. And if you look at the majority of the medium to large size companies in North America, this isn't about like offices overseas working in other countries. This is about your North American, Canadian, or American office. You have employees who come from 5, 10, 15, 20 different cultural backgrounds, all working together in the same office, working together on the same teams, having different positions of leadership, different positions of responsibility. And those cultural differences can cause significant issues for communication, for teamwork, for leadership styles. They can cause all sorts of misunderstandings. There are many unconscious biases that people aren't even aware of, but that will affect their reactions to people from other cultures and their behaviors. So that's the area that I focus on, is helping these companies who have a very mixed, very diverse cultural workforce, helping them to deal with those cultural differences. One thing I'd like to add here, because I'm sure a number of your listeners will have had some sort of cultural training, but the vast majority of cultural training has been done based on a paradigm of using cultural stereotypes. You learn some principles of culture, and then you learn, well, Chinese culture is like this, and American culture is like this, and German culture is like this. When you go to China, you should act like this, things like that. And those stereotypes are sometimes true, but they absolutely are not universally true. And especially when you're talking about people who have come from another country and moved to North America, working in a North American environment, they may have changed some of those cultural values. There's so many differences there, and diversity is about getting rid of stereotypes. Gender diversity, getting rid of stereotypes about men and women. Racial diversity, getting rid of stereotypes about different races. But in culture, most cultural training is still relying on stereotypes. So in cultural diversity, my program, I've developed a program which entirely eliminates those cultural stereotypes, teaches culture in an entirely different way that still enables you very, very much to understand those cultural differences, but to do so on an individual basis based on this individual's actual behavior, rather than based on a stereotype of, oh, this person is from India, so I should act like this, they should be like this.
Okay, and when you're dealing with cultural diversity or any diversity in general, I found that it doesn't matter if somebody is an atheist or extremely religious. A lot of times they have the same biases. And what do you think what do you think brings that about?
Well, like every human being on the planet has biases. That is inevitable. This is not about eliminating all biases. This is about enabling people to recognize their biases. When we talk in DEI, when we talk about bias, we usually talk about unconscious bias. Biases we have that we're simply not aware of. I'll give a very simple example from the cultural side. Yeah, we'll talk about individualist and collectivist cultures. So individualist cultures are ones that focus more on the individual, what I want, my accomplishments, things like this. Collectivist cultures focus more on the group, what's best for the group. Now, the way that people exhibit behaviors in those two different environments is very, very different. Let's say we have someone whose personality is very much a leadership personality. They like taking a position of leadership. Now, in an individualist culture, that leadership will be demonstrated by standing out from the crowd, by being independent, by, in meetings, speaking up, actively disagreeing with other people, actively pushing your ideas, seeking to really stand out and be recognized as a leader. In a collectivist culture, a person with that exact same leadership personality is very unlikely to act in that way. They're much more likely, instead of taking a dominant public role, they're going to work behind the scenes. Like before a meeting, they're going to talk with different people individually, one-on-one, explain their ideas, get them on board, and go into the meeting knowing that they already have support and consensus for what they want to do. They may have other people express some of those ideas instead of doing it themselves. They're more likely to present it as, this is what we as a group want to do, rather than, this is my idea. Now, where unconscious bias comes in is that guy from the individualist culture. He expects a person with a leadership personality to be that, like, stand out from the crowd, take credit for his own ideas. When he sees the person from the collectivist culture, he's not taking credit for his own ideas. He seems to be relying on the group. He seems to be afraid to do anything for himself. This is how the individualist perceives it. He interprets those behaviors that this person is not a leader. It does not have a leadership personality. And this would be an unconscious bias. The way he interprets different personalities, different behaviors, is based on his culture. And when he gets someone from another culture, the same behaviors could mean something entirely different. So that would be an unconscious bias, and making people aware of that so they can recognize, when a person from a collectivist culture acts this way, it has a different meaning than it does in my own culture.
All right. And what do you think is one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about cultural diversity?
I wouldn't necessarily say this is a misconception, but a problem. There are tons of arguments online about the dangers of cultural diversity. Many, many real life, actual examples where they have put people from different cultures together and it has been disastrous. It's caused violence, it's caused cultural or racial conflict, all these types of things. And there are very real, very valid examples of where this has happened. But to me, this is not real cultural diversity. This is being culturally diverse. Being culturally diverse just means stick a whole bunch of different cultures together. But if those different cultures do not understand each other, are still subject to the same prejudices, the same biases, it really is many times a recipe for disaster. What you want is to go from being culturally diverse to having real cultural diversity, where those different groups can actually understand each other, they address the prejudices, they're aware of the biases, so there's able to be communication, interaction between those different groups.
Okay. And I know you kind of touched on it there for a little bit about people have the misconceptions that they have about, it's not being cultural diverse, but cultural diversity. And you have some people that do the argument that understanding cultural diversity, or multiculturalism is a word that they throw out, is something that violates their freedom. How would you go about addressing a negative idea like that being diverse would violate your freedoms?
Well, I guess in some ways I would agree. Everybody has the freedom to be ignorant. I guess that's a right. That's a freedom. I can't force you not to be deliberately ignorant. Cultural diversity is not about forcing you to accept their cultural behaviors, to act like them. Just like when we talk about LGBTQ diversity, understanding the LGBTQ community, accepting things like same-sex marriage, doesn't mean I'm forcing you to marry someone of the same sex yourself. So it's not about forcing these behaviors on you. It's simply about increasing your own knowledge, increasing your own understanding of others. And if you, for whatever reason, are opposed to that, if you really want to remain ignorant, I guess you have the freedom to do so. I can't force you. Nobody else can force you to. It, to me, seems a very weird definition of freedom. I think we achieve much more freedom on an individual level by increasing our understanding of the world around us, of other people, of other cultures, everything like that.
All right. And how your presentations that you give to companies and other groups, how is that different than what people are used to that's called sensitivity training? I know you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but
Yeah,
what specifically is the difference between what you do and what people are used to having attend?
I'll give a simple example. So, and this is specifically for culture. The typical cultural training, which I will guarantee probably 95 to 98% of anybody listening to this who has gone through any sort of cultural training, this is what they've learned. Take the example I've already used of individualist and collectivist cultures. They will begin by explaining what is an individualist culture, what is a collectivist culture, how does this impact their behaviors, etc. Second step will then be to identify, for example, Chinese culture is a collectivist culture, or Asian cultures tend to be collectivist cultures. America is an individualist culture. Germany is an individualist culture. So it'll go like that, which again is relying on stereotypes. Now, the problem with this is if you go to China, yes, the foundations of Chinese culture are very collectivist. The influences of Confucianism and Buddhism and all these things are very collectivist. Many people in China certainly will tend more to the collectivist side, but there absolutely are Chinese who are not collectivists, who are very, very individual, particularly the younger generation who are growing up exposed to Western culture, going to school overseas. And in the US, we have people who are very, very collectivist. So this is a stereotype which is not at all universally true and can lead to a lot of problems, a lot of misunderstandings by trying to apply it in this manner. In addition, it just reinforces stereotypes. It reinforces unconscious biases that we may have. Now, the way I will approach it is I'll start off the same way, explain individualist and collectivist culture. But I will never talk about this culture is collectivist, this culture is individualist. Instead, I'll say, okay, let's say you meet somebody. You have no idea what country they're from. You have no idea of their culture. What behaviors would an individualist exhibit? And what behaviors would collectivists exhibit that would be different from each other? For example, in speaking, ask them to talk about themselves. An individualist is going to use I, me, my much more. I did this. I, me, my. They're an individualist. Collectivist is much more likely to use us, we, our more often. So instead of I am the vice president of marketing in XYZ corporation. That would be the individualist. The collectivist would be, I work for a large international corporation called XYZ. So they're identifying them more by the organization they belong to than by their personal position. And again, like there are many, many different things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it right now, but there are many different things in the way an individualist and a collectivist will act, will talk, will behave. And if you know what to look for, you know what types of questions to ask that are going to elicit answers that are going to help you identify, are they more individualist or more collectivist? You're going to know what types of things to look for in their use of language, what types of things to look for in their behavior, in their reactions to the things that you say to them, everything like this, that help you to identify this person as an individual is more on the individualist or the collectivist side. And this has nothing to do with what country they're from, what culture they're part of. It has nothing to do with stereotypes. It's purely based on that person's actual behavior.
And what one or two things could somebody do on an everyday basis to get better at learning about cultures and trying to identify their biases?
Well, in identifying biases, first step, do learn about like basic cultural categories like individualist and collectivist. All these, there are very well defined, very well studied categories. Learn about those. Tons of online stuff about this. Very, very easy to learn it. When you learn it, you're probably going to be learning in the context that I explained, where they're going to be using stereotypes. Just focus on learning those different categories. Once you've learned those categories, second step, start thinking about, okay, so what are the differences in how someone in this category would behave versus how someone in this category, making yourself more aware of those things. So when you're meeting people from other cultures, you're able to consciously identify those things. Third step, biases. And this is very, very important. It's a big part of my training is I'll ask people, okay, so if you are an individualist and you are working with a collectivist, what adjectives are you likely to use to describe that person? And people right away will generally come up with negative adjectives. They're not leaders. They're too dependent on others. They care too much what other people think. Things like that. Then I'll ask, okay, so what would the collectivist think of the individualist? Oh, they're too selfish. They only care about themselves. They want to take credit for everything. They're aggressive, everything like this. And after we've done that, I'll say, okay, guys, those are the cultural biases. These are the moment you meet someone from another culture and you find yourself interpreting their behaviors using these terms, be very conscious that could be a cultural bias and be watching for that. So these are all things that people can do on their own. It helps a lot to actually have someone facilitating that, someone providing training, all that types of thing. But it's absolutely something that you can do on your own and start developing that awareness. A huge part of it is just making yourself be more consciously aware of it. And then, of course, absolutely exposing yourself to people from different cultural backgrounds, getting outside of your comfort zone.
This is Glass City Humanist, a show about humanism by a humanist.
Well, let's kind of shift gears a little bit, but not too far. When I was looking at the information in your biography, it says that you co-founded a nonprofit organization to help a Chinese ethnic minority group, the Mosuo. What is it?
Mosuo. Yeah.
I have never heard of them.
Nope. Even in China, a lot of people haven't heard of them. They're not a very well-known group at all.
And where are they located at? Is there a particular area?
So a little background for people listening to this.
Sure.
China has more than 50 different ethnic minority groups. And this would be very similar to Native peoples in North America. These are groups that ethnically, culturally, historically are completely different than the Han Chinese majority. They have their own culture, they have their own language. And over the 5,000 plus years of Chinese history, as China grew, they conquered different areas and added them to the country. But some of these groups still retained their cultural identity, their language. So the Mosuo are one of these ethnic minorities. They have their own language, their own culture, everything like this. They live way, way up in the Himalayas, close to the border with Tibet. They're in one of the most undeveloped regions of China. Some villages still have no running water, no electricity. The For most of them, the lifestyle is a subsistence lifestyle, very similar to how they would have lived 100 years ago. So it's a very remote area with a culture that, unlike native peoples in North America or in, Aboriginal peoples in pretty much any Western country, they are still relatively untouched. They still maintain a lot of their original culture, language, everything like that.
Okay. Yeah, because I was familiar with the Chinese trying to integrate Tibet, and I'm also familiar with the Muslim culture that they're trying to also suppress.
The Uyghurs, yes.
So I was wondering if that was similar, if they're related.
Well, no, they're not really. Well, as far as the Uyghurs, not related at all. With Tibet, the Mosuo historically are distinct from Tibet, but I think it's around 400 to 500 years ago, Tibet did conquer them. Tibet was not always a peaceful, harmony-loving place. They were actually a kingdom that conquered people around them. So the Mosuo were conquered and added to the Tibetan kingdom at one point. So they have their own religion called Daba, which is an animistic religion, but they also follow Tibetan Buddhism, and many of their male children will go to Tibet to be trained as Tibetan monks. So the two religions coexist, but they are not Tibetans themselves.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I learned something different.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Because this is, for me, one of the most fascinating aspects. And if your listeners have a chance to hear about it, I think it's great. The Mosuo are one of the last remaining matriarchal cultures on the planet. So the women are the head of the household, make all the decisions. Women tend to be the head of the community. Their culture has no marriage. In their culture, only women have private bedrooms. Men sleep in a communal sleeping area. So women have full control over the relationships, who they're going to partner with. The men will come and sleep with them at night, but they never actually live together. The men will continue to live in their own home and be responsible to their family. The women live in their home and are responsible for their family. There is no marriage. There is no concept of finding a soulmate, a lifelong bond, anything like this. The Mosuo principle is very, very simple. If we're happy together, we stay together. If we're not happy together, we should separate and find someone else. So there are Mosuo couples that last a few days. There are Mosuo couples that last several decades. But you never see a Mosuo couple who are unhappy together. Yeah, and this system also means the biological father is not the father to the child. The father role is taken by the uncle. So if a Mosuo man gets a woman pregnant, he has no responsibility to care for that child. But that doesn't mean that he gets off scot-free. Every sister, every aunt in his own family who has a child, he shares parenting responsibilities for those children. And the woman that he got pregnant, same thing in her family. All her brothers, her uncles are going to help to care for that child. So these are large extended families with several generations all living together. So it's a very, very different concept of parenting. People tend to think it's very weird, but one of the big benefits of this is when a couple breaks up, in almost every country in the world, if a married couple break up, they have children, they're going to fight over division of assets. They're going to fight over custody of the children. It can be very traumatic for the children. They're losing a parent, everything like this. Mosuo culture, that simply doesn't happen. No fighting over property because they've never shared property. No fighting over the children because the father never had a role in the child's life. So for the children, it provides a tremendous degree of stability. So that was one of the main reasons that I developed a passion for the Mosuo culture and started my charity to help them, was both to help them with their own development and to help make people outside more aware of this really fascinating, really unique culture.
Yeah, it is. I'm very interested in hearing about it. And I'll probably look up some more information after we're done. So do they live in like stable villages or are they nomadic?
Actually, historically, they were nomadic. And this is part of the reason they developed the matriarchal culture. Historically, when they were traveling around, the men would travel ahead to kind of, detect danger, defeat people attacking them, things like this. And it was the women who were the center of the community who actually made decisions. Now, this was hundreds of years ago. For hundreds of years, they have lived where they are now. So they are very much in place. They live in their own communities, little villages. When I went there, my first time I went there, I lived in a tiny Mosuo village on the side of a mountain in the home of a local Mosuo family. And I lived there for a month, just experiencing their day-to-day life, the culture, everything like that. So yeah, now today they are very established. They have a set area where they live, but historically they used to be nomadic.
Okay. Well, as we kind of wrap up our talk for today, what I like to do is turn the mic over to our guests and give you the opportunity to promote whatever it is that you want to promote and tell us maybe something else that you think that our listeners should know, and go ahead and take it from there.
All right. Well, actually, I have three things I'd like to promote. First, obviously, is my company, The Language of Culture. If people are interested to learn more about it, they can go to my website, languageofculture.net. And there's a video there that provides an excellent explanation of what we do, and also multiple blog articles that I've written. Second, very definitely the Mosuo. That's spelled Mosuo. Definitely, if you've got any interest, go online and search for them. Wikipedia has an entry that most of the information there was actually taken from a website that I set up a long time ago, but that website is now defunct. But the Wikipedia article is great, and there's lots of other information about them as well. And then we also talked briefly about the Clergy Project. Quickly, for those who aren't familiar, the Clergy Project is an organization specifically for religious leaders who have become atheists. And the main focus is particularly on those who are still religious leaders, like they're still in their churches. They still have positions of leadership. They're trying to get out, but it's very, very difficult. Many of them, their house is provided by the church. So if they tell their church that they're an atheist, they lose their job and they lose their home in one swoop. They could be looking at losing their family. It's a very difficult, very traumatic situation to face. So we provide support for them. So just search online for the Clergy Project. You'll find our website. And if you'd like to get more information or support the organization, we would love that.
Okay. And yes, and I will add some links to the various websites on the show notes once this is published. And John, I really appreciate your time today, and good luck in your future endeavors.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. I'm always happy to get the word out on any of these topics. They're all things that I'm quite passionate about.
Thank you for listening. For more information about the topics in this episode, please visit the episode page at glasscityhumanist.show. Glass City Humanist is an outreach of the Secular Humanists of Western Lake Erie. Sholi can be reached at humanistswle.org. Glass City Humanist is hosted, written, and produced by Douglas Berger, and he's solely responsible for the content. Our theme music is Glass City Jam, composed using the Amplify Studio. See you next time.